Okay, so thanks for the introduction. So this is a paper that we recently published at DSN and received the Best Paper Award. This is being co-authored by Alejandro Ranchal-Pedrosa, and this is a joint work between University of Sydney, Protocol Labs, and the Redbelly network. It's about accountability, so I'm glad that Tim introduced accountability to some extent by talking about punishment and negative rewards, because this is something that we will build upon in this talk in order to explain how we can tolerate a majority of malicious players, right? I should not say players because I'm a distributed computer scientist. I'm not a game theoretician. And what you're going to look at here are Byzantine processes. That's how we call these arbitrary behaving processes or machines. And you'll see that I'll also introduce something that is not Byzantine, neither correct, but another kind of figures is interesting. So just to give a little bit of background about blockchains, they may fork, right? And the classic model is a blockchain that would fork at some point. And you can think about the blockchain as this chain that will at some point become a directed acyclic graph if there is a fork or tree, just the way you want to think about it. But what is interesting here is that we have several consensus instances. One consensus instance per blockchain index, right? And during this blockchain, this consensus instance, we will have potentially multiple attempts to solve consensus, right? So we would start with the genesis block on the left-hand side, and then we would append blocks to the right, and grow the blockchains from left to right. In this example, we have successfully reached consensus on the second index, right after the genesis block, because there is a unique block that has been appended, right? And as long as we have this total order, it means that everything is going well. We're succeeding at solving consensus. There is a unique block for each of these indexes. But at some point, at the very end, on the right-hand side, you can see that we have failed. The consensus attempt has failed in the second step. We ended up having multiple blocks for the same index of the blockchain, right? So this is not agreement, this is disagreement, right? So this is why we have it. But this is okay. Like in classic blockchain, this is tolerable in some sense because we want to reach consensus eventually. Therefore, we tolerate to have disagreements from time to time, as long as we can get rid of this disagreement later on. That's why we have multiple consensus attempts per consensus instance. Right? So the problem with this disagreement is that if they stay for long enough, if we're not able to eventually reach consensus of this particular index, then we might end up in this double spending situation, which is probably the worst thing that can happen in the blockchain system. It essentially means that we might have conflicting transactions in distinct block or distinct branches, and someone can double spend, can reduce the same coins in two different transactions, as if he was stealing assets from the system. Right? This is the worst thing that can happen. We don't want that to happen. So if the consensus failure persists, then a hacker can potentially double spend. But classic blockchain will typically tolerate a minority of failures among the distributed system. And they would typically require synchrony, which means that all the messages that are sent in the system will be delivered in a bounded amount of time that is known by the algorithm. So this is a strong assumption. And we have shown that actually, you can violate the synchrony assumption by doing some network attack, whether it's BGP hijacking or ARP spoofing the local area network, such that you can delay messages and you don't even need to control as an attacker a large amount of the distributed systems running the blockchain protocol. Right, so this was a paper published a while ago, 2017 at DSN. And we showed that essentially we could potentially double spend in this environment using this delay of messages using Ethereum protocol as it was run by R3, Consortium of Financial Institutions, and also in another instance as it was used by a large banking industry. Yes?
Just to clarify, when you say consensus attempt, that is not like, you don't expect to have like finality or confirmation at the end of that. This is just like a block proposal.
Actually, there is, so the definition of the problem will come next and I will explain, but we want this attempt to eventually terminate. Whether it fails at solving consensus, like disagreeing or agreeing, we don't really care, but we want this attempt to terminate. Because otherwise we would have a liveness issue. Okay, so eventually we would like to reach consensus successfully, right? Which means that, okay, we might have some unsuccessful attempts like it was written in red here. But at some point for this particular consensus instance K, we would like to have an attempt that is successful, which means, oh, we have pruned all the other branches. Now we have found the unique blocks, the unique block that should be appended at this particular index K. And this is the one, right? We would like to eventually solve consensus, even though we have failed in the past. Therefore, this way we can avoid double spending. Okay, so it leads to the problem that we're looking at right now. It's called the long-lasting blockchain problem. How do you make sure that the blockchain will last for a long period of time, knowing that some consensus instance K can fail? So look at this diagram where time increases from left to right. This is one consensus instance, but within this consensus instance, there might be multiple consensus attempts, right? So at the beginning, we have consensus attempt 1 that fails, which means, we have a fork, potentially. At some other time, we try another consensus attempt, number 2, we fail again, and so on and so forth. But we would like to have at the end a consensus attempt that leads to success. And then we know that we have put all the branches and we're in a good state and we can move on. Now, in order to define this problem, there is one property that is very important, is termination, that relates to your question. What we need is to make sure that every consensus attempt terminates, right? We don't want to get stuck. We want to have progress, right? So one of the property of this problem that we would like to solve is to make sure that every consensus attempt terminates. And such that we can eventually start a new consensus attempt.
Question?
Yes.
These are probabilistic things.
No. The solution I'm presenting to this problem is deterministic, but it relies on this assumption that we have partial synchrony. So we're going to violate synchrony, we're going to not rely on synchrony, but we will assume partial synchrony. Because otherwise, in the asynchronous model, you would have a problem.
No, it's asynchronous. You will terminate in another one, 10 rounds. If you do that deterministically, there are well now impossibilities. I mean, you need some linear rounds. If you do it faster than that, you won't be able to get consensus with probability 1. So don't you have to say, I'm going to achieve consensus with actual, something somewhere over. We need to do that.
My assumption will be partial synchrony.
So even partial
My property will be eventually algorithm synchrony. I cannot tell you when.
Okay.
I'm just saying eventually. So it's kind of weak. We're going to use a deterministic consensus algorithm, but you're right. This deterministic consensus algorithm may fail, again and again and again. But eventually, it will succeed. So it's eventual consensus. So I'm going to use a deterministic consensus algorithm, that's true. But this is a deterministic consensus algorithm that may fail for a lot of time. Okay. The second property that is important for this problem.
Can I ask that question? So for one instance, are these parallel attempts or sequential attempts?
Sequential. And that's also why we need one to terminate in order to start a second. Okay, so LLB convergence is another property of this problem of long-lasting blockchain that says the following: there is a finite number of failures after which there is a success. You can understand that helps with safety because if we have consensus reached, and we know that there is a unique block. But it also helps in terms of liveness because it means that we have appended a block, we have done some useful work. So if we can solve these two properties, then we will be done with the long-lasting blockchain problem. Okay, so how can you tolerate a majority of failures? And that might be counterintuitive. I've heard you think, okay, if there is a majority of nodes that are misbehaving in my network, then first, I cannot ensure liveness at all. If they decide to stop acting, I don't have a useful blockchain protocol. I cannot solve the long-lasting blockchain problem because I cannot even append a single block. Right? But there is a very interesting observation. So I've been working on distributed systems for 20 years now. And when I started working on doing research on distributed systems, at the time, we were talking about data centers. We were talking about cloud computing. We were talking about distributed databases. Essentially, we were talking about closed networks. And what was very interesting about the model of figures in these closed networks was that most of the figures were omission figures, crashes, right? So a crash is essentially a figure after which you don't do anything at all forever, right? The machine doesn't act at all. Omission figures in general would be omission of sending, omission of receiving a message, but it's not an actively malicious behavior. You see what I mean? It's like an omission figure that doesn't do much, right? And that was essentially what we would see as the most likely kind of failures. There could, like in this model that we were studying at the time, there could be, or there were some failures that were Byzantine failures or actively violating the specification of the protocol. But these failures were quite rare. Having a bit flip was not the common thing, right? So that was back in the days. Now we're in a different world. We're looking at blockchain, and it has a different failure model that is very interesting. The big difference is that we're talking about open networks now, right? Not closed networks. And in these networks, like typically, a blockchain protocol will incentivize every single participant of the distributed system to be active in two ways. Either you're active because you are contributing to the protocol, and usually you receive a reward for that. It could be a mining process, and then you get a reward for that. Or it could be active in the sense that you want to steal assets from the system. So what you do is you try to team up with sufficiently many machines in the distributed environment, you run an attack, try to double spend, for example, and then you get a reward, like Tim said, by maybe extracting the market value of the block. But what is interesting is that most of these machines will be monitored at all times because they return a reward to the owner of this machine, right? So if someone sees that the machine doesn't act anymore, it will probably reboot it. It is very unlikely that the machine will be crashed forever. That's why it leads to a different failure model where most of the failures are actually active failures and not necessarily omission failures. There is also another aspect that we're using in order to tolerate the majority of failures, which is accountability. So back in 2019, 2020, we defined what is the accountable consensus problem or accountable Byzantine agreement problem. The idea here is the following. It's not just the consensus problem, it's the accountable consensus problem. So what does it mean in addition to consensus? It means the following. If you are in a setting where you can solve consensus, then solving the accountable consensus problem is solving consensus. If you're in a setting where you cannot solve consensus because it's impossible, then solving the accountable consensus problem is finding the nodes that are responsible for disagreeing. Okay? So it's slightly more than just the consensus. You solve consensus if you can, you find the responsible nodes that have led to the disagreement if you cannot. So what does it mean in other terms? Actually, the accountable consensus problem is the following. It's the problem of the accountable consensus of two things. To solve consensus, if the number of Byzantine faults makes your consensus problem solvable, and in this case, we consider the partially synchronous environment. So it's when F is lower than n/3, where F is the number of Byzantine failures and n is the number of nodes that you have in your distributed system. And for every honest replica to eventually output at least a number of faulty replicas if two honest replicas output distinct decisions. FD here relates to deceitful faults. These are the faults where we have active participants that are equivocating first. They are actively misbehaving in the network. But what is important to remember here is that either you solve consensus if you can, which means F is lower than n/3, or if you cannot, and you obtain a disagreement, you identify who is responsible for the disagreement. So now you can start thinking about how you handle a majority of failures, right? You try to solve consensus. First attempt. Do you succeed? Yes, everything is good. Do you fail? Okay. Now you have to move to the second attempt. But what you know now is a set of processes that are responsible for your first attempt to fail. Right? So what can we do now?
If liveness is broken, then the first attempt and terminate. Do we have anything?
So solving the problem is ensuring that every attempt terminates. And for that, we need an extra assumption, which is we consider that in this network, most of the failures are actively contributing to liveness. Whether it's for reaching disagreement or reaching agreement, they're actively contributing to liveness, right? So we're going to have to bound, yes, Jovan used, we already know that, we would have to bound the number of omission failures by n over 1. Otherwise, we cannot do much. But again, it relies on the assumption that we're looking at a different failure model, which is not the kind of failure model that we use to have improvement.
I might miss this assumption, but do you assume that all these nodes know each other? So does actively mean that I know you and got that space?
Okay. So how can we solve this problem of having a zero-loss blockchain or a ZLB blockchain solution? So we need to get rid of the synchrony assumption that I was talking about, that is common to the classic blockchain protocol, so that consensus can be reached despite network attacks. We bound the number of participants that ran consensus at the time to ensure consensus is reached deterministically. So typically we will have n, which is the maximum number, that's the number of nodes that are running the consensus. Everyone can reach everyone else, right? It's like a complete graph. Everyone can talk to each other, and they know the identity of all these n participants that are running the consensus. We're going to use an accountable consensus algorithm that tolerates any number of failures to identify misbehaving participants. Okay, so again, we're going to find a solution to the accountable consensus problem here. It's not just a consensus protocol, it's an accountable consensus protocol. So it's like a consensus protocol plus some signatures, right? Such that we can produce an undeniable proof of fraud if someone is equivocating first. And then we remove or replace the participants when we identify them as guilty of the consensus attempt failure. We repeat the step above to finally reach a state where consensus will be reached successfully, right? So the trick is simple. Is if you fail, it means that you can detect who is responsible for the failure. You kick them out of the system and you move on. Okay? Yes.
So in accountable consensus, I output a set of parties that I believe to be faulty, but I don't know that they're faulty. And in particular, we don't all agree on this set, right? So in the next step, I remove these parties from my consideration, but the removals may be inconsistent between players.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? So people have different ideas of how many people are participating and who is participating. So how do you deal with that?
So we are in a partially synchronous environment. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So let me go through that. We remove synchrony by assuming partial synchrony. And the nice thing about partial synchrony is that if you're honest and you're aware of an undeniable proof of fraud, you can just disseminate it and you know that every honest will eventually receive it. Once you converge with the state where all the honest have the exact same set, then you're guaranteed that you converge with the exact same n or n prime, and then you can run another consensus instance. Does it make sense?
If you're saying eventually we will agree on the set of people that behaved faulty. But if we did that, then we solved consensus. We agreed on a set.
Yeah.
So
let's say in this room we have a third of the participants that are malicious, and they manage to make sure that we reach a disagreement. Right? By using an accountable consensus protocol, you guarantee that you can detect at least a third of malicious participants in this room that are equivocated. And therefore you can remove them. Now, how do you achieve this third of undeniable proof of fraud? Is by getting the messages that are convincing you of taking a decision as a correct process. Right? And if you concatenate two messages that are signed by the same individual showing that he has lied, then you have the proof that you need, right? Now, if I'm in a partially synchronous environment, it means that I will be able to disseminate this proof, right, to everyone, right? Eventually, thanks to partial synchrony, this undeniable proof of fraud will be disseminated to all the correct processes. Now, it could be the case that you try to remove the people for which you have an undeniable proof of fraud, but it's not the exact same set because someone has received more than you, and you're not aware yet of those. This will not break the protocol, right? You try to remove them, you may fail, but eventually you have so many undeniable proof of fraud that you converge to the state where every correct will say, we're disregarding these guys. We end up with a new number of consensus processes, which is n prime, which is lower than n, right? And then we try to redo the consensus. We may fail again, but at some point, you will succeed. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we use DBFT for bounding the number of participants that run consensus at a time to ensure consensus is reached deterministically. So DBFT is a democratic biting consensus algorithm, and it's deterministic to ensure the answer question you had before. It's deterministic, but it's going to be used as an attempt in order to solve the problem. We use an accountable consensus algorithm that tolerates any number of failures to identify misbehaving participants. Here, actually, this is just called polygraph. This is an algorithm that we published that is exactly the same as DBFT, plus some cryptographic signatures that are appended to messages. So it allows DBFT to become accountable because now you receive proof of fraud that allows you to exclude other processes. We remove or replace these participants when we identify them. And this allows us to converge towards a state where sufficiently many honest participants reach consensus. Unfortunately, I only have 5 minutes left, so I have to cherry pick the slides that I'm going to present. But I think this one is important. We have a series of assumptions we have to make. And this is to answer the question below that. If the number of omission figures was too big, we wouldn't be able to solve the long-lasting problem, long-lasting watching problem. So we need a slowly adaptive adversary, first of all, that selects at most f lower than 5n/9. I'm happy to explain why we take this bound, but I will just continue for now, and we can discuss that maybe at the break. This bound is a bit restricted here. We know how to do better, but it's just for the simplicity of the presentation that we keep f lower than 5n/9. These are faulty consensus participants among the n participants that execute the consensus. Now, among the f faulty nodes, okay, we have two types of different faulty behaviors. Some that are Byzantine. They're not restricted. They can do omission figures, right? They're Byzantine. They do arbitrary things. They can stop acting as well, but they can send wrong messages and so on. But we also have F minus T that are alive but corrupt. Alive but corrupt is a model that was published at CCS, where essentially it means that these processes will try to attack the system if they know they can reach safety violation. Otherwise, they won't do anything bad. We assume a public key infrastructure that associates participants to their public key. We assume a large pool of M, which is much bigger than n nodes, where 2n/3 are honest, and the remaining are alive but corrupt. And this will help us make sure that when we're replacing guilty processes by other processes from this pool, we will eventually converge to a state where we have sufficiently many correct compared to the number of malicious processes. But again, this pool of M can be very, very large. And we still have a subset of these nodes that should be alive but corrupt. So the large part of all these nodes will be alive but corrupt. Okay, so if we represent that graphically, this would be essentially the omission figures that we can have, or the Byzantine nodes that can take some omission figures. Thank you. This would be the correct ones, and this would be the ones that are alive but corrupt. Oh, sorry. F minus T. No, sorry. Alive but corrupt, Byzantine, and corrupt. Yes?
So in this case, is M a set of nodes that are secretly corrupt, like either secretly corrupt
No.
or fully corrupt?
No. The M is a pool of nodes we can choose from when we replace. So because we're excluding some malicious or alive but corrupt processes, we need to replace them at some point because we might end up having an empty set of nodes where we consensus, right? We might have to inject new nodes. These new nodes will be taken from this pool of M.
And are these live? You feel that I type these like not even live in part of the protocol, they can be cycled in.
True.
User cycles.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't have to be, that's a good point. They don't have to be live all the time, but it's just for simplicity that we have these strong assumptions. Okay, so we've run some experiments. So we did a geo-distributed experiments where we implemented this blockchain protocol, this zero-loss blockchain protocol that was solving a long-lasting blockchain problem. And we built upon Redbelly blockchain, which was a blockchain published at Oakland in 2021. Because it achieves very good performance at large scale. So typically, its performance increases with the number of proposers that it has in its consensus, because it combines the block into a superblock. We did distributed experiments out of US and Europe. We had 90 machines, and I'm going to skip the details, but essentially we tried to test Facebook Libra, but at the time it was not giving good performances. So we only took odd stuff, like the default implementation in C++ from the original version of odd stuff. Since then, there have been a lot of different versions for odd stuff. We use polygraph, which is accountable, but it's just a state machine verification, just like odd stuff. Zero loss blockchain, this is the result that we have, and Redbelly. So Redbelly has good performances even at a small number of replicas. The reason is that it doesn't have the overhead of accountability. You don't need to sign as many messages in Redbelly. What we can see is that polygraph degrades in performance. It's because it has very heavy signatures that are involved, at least in the implementation we tried that was coming from the original paper. But then ZLB would have performance that would improve. The reason is that it has lower cryptographic load to implement compared to polygraph, but it also benefits from the superblock optimization of the Redbelly blockchain. So eventually, it reaches performance that is quite close to Redbelly when you increase sufficiently the size of the network. We did other experiments, but I guess I'm going to run out of time to describe them. It's just that we implemented the attacks, equivocation for proposal, but also equivocation in the reliable broadcast. What we observed was that if you increase the size of your system, then the attacks tend to be harder to execute successfully. And the reason is that by the time you manage to do a successful attack, you have already detected who are the guilty participants. So the honest will start ignoring the messages coming from faulty participants. So that's why the number of disagreement will degrade as we increase the size of the system. And we tried different distribution of delays to do this experiment in a geo-distributed fashion. We've built a zero loss payment application. So just to give you an idea about that, and I will conclude on this. You need several assumptions, but you can build a zero loss payment application. So you need to only look at assets that are fungible. You cannot look at non-fungible tokens, for example, because here we would like to reimburse the victim with the coins that we slashed from guilty process. So it has to be equivalent. The attacker can fork into a branch. We can bound the number of branches that are created by the coalition. in the blockchain. And we have to bound the maximum gain that someone can do during a transfer in order to make sure that we can reimburse all the victims using the coins that are staked by the consensus participants. So each consensus participants will have to deposit or stake, if you want, some coins that are kept for sufficiently many blocks, which is denoted by M. And the transaction will be committed if it reaches a certain block depth N. Finally, Byzantine replica cannot communicate infinitely faster than honest replica in different partitions, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to implement that, but it's a realistic assumption. The attack can be summarized here, where Alice is trying to double spend, but then she gets caught by the honest participants, and then the replica that she has hacked will have its coin slashed in order to reimburse the victim, which in this case would be Bob or Carol. But I'm happy to go into the details if there is any question. Thank you for your attention.